Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling open source AI.
Oh,
You sent over a ton of research, articles, policy proposals.
A lot of stuff.
The works. We've got academic studies, news articles, think tank publications, even some stuff that reads like a spy thriller.
It is a real mix, and I think that kind of reflects just how complex the whole landscape is, especially when you think about the U.S. and China, vying for that dominance in the AI space.
Right. Okay, so our mission today is to kind of equip you to navigate this world.
Yeah.
We'll unpack the nuances of open source AI.
Okay.
Explore its implications for innovation, security, and then we'll dive into the different ways governments are trying to grapple with it all.
Yeah, and I think maybe we can debunk a few myths along the way. For example, a lot of people think open source means everything's just free and available, but with AI, it's not always the case.
Right. I mean, even defining what open source AI actually means is tricky. It's not as simple as, here's the code, do whatever you want.
Yes.
So all these different levels of openness, depending on what parts of the AI model are accessible.
Exactly. You got to think about the weights, the data, the code itself, and then there's that whole issue of open washing.
Yeah, what is that?
Where companies try to make themselves look open source without actually being truly open.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, recently, the Open Source Initiative.
OSI.
The OSI, right?
Yeah.
The organization that sets the standards for what qualifies as open source software. Mm-hmm. They tried to define open source AI, and it sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah, there was a lot of debate, and a lot of it was about Meta's Llama model. Yeah. People assumed Llama was open source because Meta made parts of it available.
Right.
But the OSI argued that it didn't meet their criteria for open source because they hadn't released all of the training data and the source code.
Interesting. So it's a good reminder that open doesn't always mean completely open.
Right.
And to add another layer of complexity, there's a difference between open source AI models, like that Llama 2 we were just talking about, and open source frameworks.
Right. Think of the frameworks like the tools to build the models.
Okay.
A popular example would be PyTorch, which, a little ironic, was actually developed by Meta.
Oh, wow.
So.
Given the whole debate about Llama.
Yeah.
Okay. But I guess it goes to show that even big companies like Meta are playing both sides of the field.
Right.
They've got their closed models, and then they contribute to the open source world.
It makes you think about their motivations, right?
Yeah. What are they up to?
Well, I think it comes down to business models, right? You have companies like OpenAI. Mm-hmm. They're betting on closed models.
Okay.
Charging for access to their more advanced AI.
Yeah.
OpenAI companies have to find different ways to make money.
Oh.
They might offer support services, or customized models, or even partner with larger companies to leverage those open source tools.
Got it. And then there's this whole question of performance. We always hear that closed models are just way ahead in terms of capabilities. But from the research that you sent me, it seems like open models are catching up fast.
That's one of the huge things that we're seeing is that the gap between open and closed models is shrinking, in terms of raw performance and the time it takes to reach those top tier capabilities.
So the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, they were saying that gap used to be around 24%.
Yeah.
But it's getting smaller all the time.
Right.
Imagine a world where the most cutting edge AI isn't just locked away.
Right.
In the hands of a few huge tech giants, but is available for anyone to use and build upon.
Exactly.
That's the potential here.
Yeah. It's not just hypothetical either. Epoch.ai, they've observed that open models hit those top performance levels about a year after closed models do.
Wow.
And then there's this fascinating case study that I think challenges the assumption that closed models are always going to be ahead.
You're talking about DeepSeek, right?
Yeah,
this Chinese startup that's been making headlines.
Exactly. So their model, DeepSeek R1, it's apparently outperforming some of the leading American models in certain areas, particularly in complex reasoning tasks, which I think is a significant development. It raises a lot of questions about the future of open source AI.
Right.
I think DeepSeek's success could be attributed to a couple of things. They've had some genuine breakthroughs in their algorithms, but there's also speculation that they might have distilled knowledge from OpenAI's models, kind of using those as a starting point to speed up their own development.
It sounds like something out of a spy thriller.
Yeah.
But it also highlights the challenge of controlling information flow in the open source world.
Right.
even if a company wants to keep their technology under wraps.
Yeah.
Once those elements of it are out there, they can be used in totally unexpected ways.
And I think this dynamic is playing out on a global scale, particularly between the U.S. and China. And I think both countries have very different approaches to open source AI.
So the U.S. has like this long history of open source development. Mm-hmm. It's almost part of the tech DNA here.
Yeah.
Like you see Google and Meta releasing open source frameworks and models, even while their core businesses rely on proprietary software. It's a delicate balance.
Right.
China, on the other hand, it seems like they've made a real strategic shift towards open source AI in recent years.
I think so.
Their government is actively promoting it, and Chinese companies are really seeing the benefits, especially with all the U.S. export controls. Mm-hmm. Limiting their access to high-end chips needed to build massive AI models from scratch.
Right. They're using it as a way to kind of leapfrog those limitations.
Oh, I see. So they're using it as a way to kind of like stay in the game.
Exactly.
But here's what I find mind-boggling. Even with this big push for self-reliance, the Chinese open-source AI ecosystem is still deeply intertwined with the American one. It's a little bit paradoxical, right?
Yeah.
Like, Chinese developers have been relying heavily on models like Meta's Llama.
Right.
And there was even that report about researchers affiliated with the PLA, China's military, using Llama for intelligence gathering.
Oh,
despite Meta's attempts to, like, restrict its use for military purposes.
It's so hard to control.
It just shows how difficult, maybe impossible, it is to really build walls in the open source world.
Yeah.
It's not just a one-way street either. Even American companies are now starting to use some of the Chinese open models.
Well, we're seeing this increasing integration of the two ecosystems, which makes this whole question of regulation so much more complex.
Because each country is kind of grappling with how to balance the potential of open source AI with the risks that it poses. Mm. And we're seeing, like, a real patchwork of approaches around the world.
Yeah, totally.
In the U.S., we've got those executive orders on AI, but they don't really address open source specifically. Then you've got California that tried to regulate advanced AI models, but their bill was vetoed after facing pushback.
A lot of pushback.
From the industry and the open source community.
Right.
The EU, on the other hand, is moving forward with their AI Act.
Yeah.
And it mostly excludes open source AI from regulation.
Right.
Unless the model is deemed high risk. The UK seems to be taking a more hands-off approach, trying to foster innovation without stifling the industry with too much regulation.
Yeah.
And then there's China, emphasizing self-reliance in their AI strategy. But it's still unclear how their regulations, which don't explicitly exclude open source AI, will be applied in practice. It's like this huge tangle.
The mess.
Of competing interests, values, anxieties, all swirling around this incredibly powerful technology.
It's crazy.
Yeah,
I know.
I know.
Wild.
Okay, so we've got this global patchwork of regulations.
Yeah.
And no one seems to have a clear answer on how to deal with open source AI. But before we get into potential policies, I think it's important to kind of like step back and understand the key considerations at play here.
Absolutely. We need a framework to kind of help us navigate this, complex landscape. Luckily, the authors of that report you sent, U.S. Open Source AI Governance, they've laid out these 6 key considerations, 3 ideological and 3 geopolitical, to help us evaluate all the different policy options.
All right, let's break those down, starting with the ideological side.
Okay, so ideologically, we've got the potential for accelerated technological progress, increased transparency, and a more distributed power structure when it comes to AI.
Yeah.
These are often seen as the core benefits of open source.
So faster progress, more openness, a level playing field, those sound like great things.
Yeah.
On the surface, at least.
Right.
But are there downsides to this open approach, especially with something as powerful as AI?
Well, that's where the geopolitical considerations come in. The report highlights concerns about Chinese misuse of U.S. open source AI, the possibility of hidden vulnerabilities, backdoors being inserted into open source tools, and the overall impact on global power dynamics.
So it's not as simple as open is good, closed is bad.
It's way more nuanced than that.
Okay, so let's dive deeper into each of these.
Okay.
Starting with the potential for accelerated progress. How exactly does open source AI lead to faster development?
Think of it like a huge collaborative brainstorming session, right?
Yeah.
With open models, anyone can access those building blocks,
right.
tinker with the code, experiment with new applications. And this leads to faster progress, especially in those like niche specific use cases where you need specialized AI tools.
And that faster development, I imagine that could lead to some real economic benefits, right?
Of course.
More efficient industries.
Exactly.
Innovative products and services, all driven by AI.
Precisely. But when it comes to those like huge groundbreaking advances, the real leaps forward in AI capabilities.
Yeah.
I think the role of open source is a bit less clear.
Right.
Historically, those big advancements have come from closed models developed by companies with a lot of resources.
But wouldn't DeepSeek kind of challenge that?
It's an interesting case.
Here's this like small startup working in the open, and they've managed to create a model that rivals some of the best closed models out there.
It's definitely compelling, and it might signal a shift. DeepSeek's success could inspire more innovation in the open source world.
Right.
But I think it's also worth noting that even DeepSeek might have benefited from the work done on closed models.
Right, like that speculation about them distilling knowledge from OpenAI's model.
Exactly, which kind of muddies the waters a little bit.
Yeah, it does.
It suggests that maybe open models, at least for now, still need those closed models to kind of like push the boundaries of what's possible. It's a complex interplay. But I think regardless of who's leading the charge,
right,
the open nature of these models does offer an advantage when it comes to transparency.
This seems like a more straightforward benefit.
Yeah.
If the code's out in the open, it's easier to scrutinize,
right,
understand how these models work.
Exactly. With open models, researchers, policymakers, even the public, they can look at the inner workings of the AI, identify biases, and see how it makes decisions.
It's like having a window into the AI's thought process.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I think is crucial for building trust in AI.
For sure.
If we're going to rely on these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
For healthcare, finance, even national security,
right.
we need to be able to understand how they work.
Yeah.
And identify potential risks.
Transparency is key to ensuring responsible AI development and deployment. And it can even lead to improvements in the models themselves, right?
Oh, how so?
More eyes on the code, more opportunities to spot errors, vulnerabilities, biases.
It's like this continuous feedback loop.
Yeah.
The open nature of the model allows for scrutiny, which leads to improvements, and then that makes the model even more reliable and trustworthy.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third ideological consideration, power distribution.
Right. The idea that open source AI democratizes access to these tools.
Yeah.
And it kind of prevents the concentration of power in the hands of a few huge corporations.
Exactly.
Or governments.
With open source AI, smaller companies, startups, research groups,
right.
Even individuals can participate in shaping the future of this technology, right?
It's not just about preventing monopoly.
It's bigger than that.
It's about fostering a more diverse and inclusive AI ecosystem.
Exactly.
Where all these different perspectives and approaches can flourish.
For sure.
Because ultimately, the way AI is developed and used, that's going to have a huge impact on society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely.
So we don't want a future where those decisions are just being made by this small, select group.
Exactly. But those are just the ideological benefits. Now we got to shift gears and talk about the geopolitical risks.
Okay, let's do it.
Starting with the big one that keeps coming up, Chinese misuse of American open source AI.
This seems to be top of mind for a lot of policymakers.
For sure.
They're worried that by making these AI models open, the U.S. is essentially handing China a technological gift.
Right.
Like on a silver platter.
It's not unfounded, though. I mean, the fear is that China could use this tech to advance its military.
Right.
Develop cyber weapons, even enhance their surveillance.
There was that report about PLA researchers using Meta's Llama model for intelligence gathering.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that really plays into those anxieties, right?
It does, and it shows just how difficult it is to control how these open models are used once they're out there. Even if a company tries to put restrictions on their model, it's really hard to enforce that in the open source world.
Right. But the report also mentions this concept of marginal risk. What does that actually mean in this context?
So it means the additional risk created by open sourcing compared to the capabilities China already has.
Okay.
It boils down to, does open sourcing this model actually give China a huge advantage?
Yeah.
Or are they already able to do that with their own tech?
So if China already has models that are just as powerful,
yeah,
the argument is that the risk is lower because they're not gaining anything truly new.
Exactly. And the report argues that China is already quite advanced, right?
Mm-hmm.
They might be relying on open source for certain things.
Yeah.
But they're making a lot of progress on their own, too.
The DeepSeek is a perfect example of that.
Exactly.
They're not just copying American models.
Yeah.
They're coming up with their own unique approaches.
Which brings up another question, Ray.
Yeah.
Is this focus on Chinese misuse overshadowing other potential risks?
Right.
Maybe even more pressing ones.
Okay.
Some people argue that the current U.S.-China competition, it's kind of amplifying those anxieties, leading to an overemphasis on this specific threat.
So maybe we need to take a step back and make sure this rivalry isn't clouding our judgment.
For sure.
We need to be realistic about the risks.
Yeah.
And avoid knee-jerk reactions that could actually stifle innovation.
Right, exactly.
Without making us any safer.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about the second geopolitical risk. Backdoor vulnerabilities.
Okay, this one sounds straight out of a spy movie.
I know.
Explain how this could actually happen in the real world.
So the concern is that, malicious actors, potentially backed by the Chinese government, right? They could insert these hidden vulnerabilities into open source AI tools that are then used by individuals, companies, even governments.
Okay.
And then these vulnerabilities are used to steal data, disrupt systems, even take control of infrastructure.
It's like planting a Trojan horse within this seemingly harmless tool.
Exactly.
And once that tool is everywhere, the attackers have a backdoor into all these systems.
Right, and this isn't just hypothetical. Right.
Open source software has been targeted before. The report talks about XZUtils. It's a data compression tool.
Right.
And it had a backdoor inserted.
Wow, so this is a real risk.
It is, and the stakes are super high when you think about government agencies, even military systems using these open source AI tools.
Yeah, a successful backdoor attack in those areas, that could be really bad.
Devastating consequences.
So we can't ignore this.
Right.
But at the same time, I don't think completely abandoning open source AI is a good option either.
It's a tough question. How do we balance the benefits of open source?
Yeah.
With the security risks?
That's the million-dollar question.
I know.
And it's one that we'll explore after a quick break. So we've got this tension, between the potential of open source AI and those very real security risks.
It's tough.
It's a tough balancing act, but I guess that's where that framework comes in.
Right, exactly.
Those 6 considerations to help us evaluate potential solutions. The report looks at 4 specific policy options.
Okay.
2 that focus on mitigating those outbound risks, primarily the Chinese misuse, and then 2 that focus on addressing the inbound risks, those vulnerabilities within the tools themselves.
Okay, so let's start with the outbound risks.
Okay.
The first policy the report explores is export controls on powerful open models.
Yeah, this is the most restrictive approach.
Okay.
And I think, as the report argues, probably the most problematic.
Okay.
Essentially, it would involve, requiring developers to vet anyone who wants to access their models.
Right.
Making sure they're not connected to the Chinese government or other, entities of concern.
So it's like a know your customer process, but for AI models.
Exactly. And the problem is that restriction would be so disruptive to the open source world,
Yeah. How so?
Imagine having to go through this whole bureaucratic screening process.
Right.
Just to download a model.
Yeah.
It would slow down everything, especially for researchers and companies working on specific applications that really rely on that rapid development of AI tools.
I imagine it would be pretty ineffective too, right?
Probably.
Information, especially in the digital world.
Yeah.
It tends to find a way.
It always does.
If someone really wants to get their hands on a model, they'll find a way around those controls.
Right. Trying to control the flow of information in open source is like trying to hold back the tide.
Yeah, good analogy.
And ironically, it might even backfire, right?
How so?
It might push American companies and researchers to start using models from other countries.
Oh.
Potentially ones with even less security.
So export controls, not really a great solution.
Not ideal.
What's the alternative for mitigating those outbound risks?
So the report suggests a more targeted and nuanced approach.
Okay.
Industry-led assessments of model release.
Okay, what is that?
This would require developers to conduct a thorough risk assessment before they release anything as open source.
So instead of this blanket ban,
right,
it's more about evaluating each model kind of on a case-by-case basis, weighing the potential risks against the benefits.
Exactly. Developers would have to consider its capabilities, its potential for misuse, and make a judgment call. They could release it fully, release it with restrictions, or even keep it proprietary if the risks are too high.
And to make sure there's accountability, the report suggests having a neutral third party, maybe an industry body or a government agency, to kind of review those assessments.
Yes, that's key. You don't want companies just rubber stamping their own stuff.
Right.
You need that independent review to ensure it's actually objective.
This seems like a much more sensible.
It seems more balanced.
And balanced approach than just those blanket export controls.
Right. It actually targets the specific risks without hurting the whole open source world.
Okay, so let's move on to the inbound risks now.
Yeah.
Those vulnerabilities that might be within the open source tools themselves.
Okay.
The first policy the report talks about is what they call Know Your Source.
I call it.
Or KYS.
Right.
For government use of open models.
This is about making sure the government's using secure and trustworthy tools.
Okay.
So it would involve mandatory security checks for any open models used in their products or services.
So basically, before the government integrates any open source AI into its systems, they need to do their homework, make sure the code is clean.
Exactly.
No hidden backdoors, no vulnerabilities.
It's similar to the process that companies use, right?
Oh, like what?
Like when they select suppliers or contractors, you need to know where it came from, who developed it, how is it built.
It seems like a no-brainer.
You would think so, right?
Yeah.
But the report does highlight some potential downsides.
Okay. What are those?
Those procedures could be burdensome, especially for smaller companies that might not have the resources to go through all those audits. So it could create barriers to entry and limit the government's access to some cool AI solutions.
So it's a trade-off between security and access.
Yeah.
You want to make sure things are secure, but you don't want to create so much red tape that it stifles innovation.
It's tough. Now, the final policy option is one I find really interesting. Open source audits.
Okay, what is that?
So instead of having these security audits done behind closed doors by government contractors, the idea is to create a public repository of audits for these popular models.
Oh, wow.
And AI frameworks.
So anyone could access it and see the results of these audits. Like consumer reports for open source AI.
That's a great way to put it. It could be huge. It would empower everyone to make better decisions about what AI tools to use. And it creates this culture of transparency and accountability.
Wouldn't it incentivize developers to focus on security?
Oh, absolutely.
Right from the start.
If they know everyone's going to be looking at their work.
Right.
They're going to be less likely to cut corners.
Yeah, it could really improve the security of open source AI overall.
For sure. But of course there are challenges, right?
What would those be?
Creating and maintaining this repository, it would be a huge task.
Who would even be responsible for that?
So the report suggests it could be a government-led thing, maybe run by an agency like CISA, since they already focus on cybersecurity.
Right.
Or it could be industry-led.
Okay.
Maybe even a collaborative project.
It sounds like it would take a lot of coordination.
A lot of resources, a lot of work.
Yeah.
But I think the benefits could be enormous.
Right. It could really transform the whole open source AI world.
Exactly.
Making it more secure, more transparent, and ultimately more trustworthy.
For sure.
So we've got these 4 options, each with its pros and cons. Yeah. What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the main thing to remember is there's no easy answer here.
Yeah.
This landscape is always changing. Policymakers have to be flexible. They need to think about those 6 considerations, weigh the benefits and the risks, and choose policies that find the right balance.
That's why these deep dives are so important.
Yeah.
We need to stay informed and be a part of these conversations.
Absolutely.
Because this technology could reshape our whole world.
I think it will.
And it's up to all of us to make sure it's used for good.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
That wraps up our deep dive into the world of open source AI.
It was a good one.
I hope you learned something new, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Sounds good.